Hello, and welcome to this special exhibit, Lincoln and His Printers, the government printing office in the Civil War. I am Devita Vance Cooks, the public printer of the United States. When the GPO opened for business in March of 1861, the first shots of the Civil War were just a few weeks away from being fired. The following years of epic struggle for the nation forged GPO's first success and established our reputation for quality, timeliness, and economy. The same workers who produced printed government documents rose to other wartime demands by guarding the GPO buildings and rushed to defend Washington itself from imminent attack in 1864. This exhibit tells a story that began with President Abraham Lincoln's appointment of John D. Defrees of Indiana as Superintendent of Public Printing, the job we now call public printer. We see GPO's first busy years through the lens of Defrees' friendship with Lincoln, reflected in original documents from the Library of Congress, in photos and engravings from the period, and in stories from GPO's own chronicles. In 1862, when Defrees and the men and women of GPO printed that most historic document, the Emancipation Proclamation, they could hardly imagine the changes that lay ahead for GPO. Technological innovation that moved from handset type and steam-driven presses to today's digital publishing and mobile apps. The demand for government information that once saw over 8,000 people working around the clock every day at GPO and still powers our workforce of about 1,900 today. And in 2013, my swearing in as Mr. Defrees' 26th successor, the first woman and the first African American to be confirmed as public printer. The story of GPO's 152 years is a story of the nation's desire for the written word, the technologies that have fueled that need, and the thousands of women and men of the GPO who have risen to the challenge of producing and distributing the documents of our federal government. It is the story of humble documents and hallowed, sometimes beautiful and sometimes utterly plain. It is the story of remarkable machines that flourished, faded, and were replaced by newer, better, and faster technologies. And it is the story of people, their careers and lives here on our own corner in Washington, DC, and reaching around the country, keeping America informed.
After Congress directed the creation of the government printing office in 1860, the printing business of Cornelius Wendell was purchased for $135,000. A few years earlier, Wendell had built the largest and best-equipped print shop in the district, and one of the best in the nation, on the corner of North Capitol and H Streets. A visitor approaching GPO first caught sight of the tall chimney of the engine house, where a 40-horsepower steam engine supplied power and heat for the office. On the first floor, in addition to space for preparing paper and mixing ink, the press room commanded greatest attention with its 23 Adams bed and platen presses and 3 Napier cylinder presses, all driven by steam, tossing off as many as 100,000 sheets per day. On the second floor, the visitor found the office of the Superintendent of Public Printing, the business office, and the proofreading room, as well as the vast composing room where as many as 93 compositors could work simultaneously, setting metal type by hand. The third floor was devoted to the bindery. In a large folding room, 150 women worked at tables where they rapidly folded and collated printed sheets, while others sewed signatures into books. Elsewhere were powerful cutting and trimming machines, areas for gold tooling and gilding, and a ruling room where pale red and blue lines were applied to pages for the many blank record books used throughout the government. In all, 350 men and women worked at GPO in 1861. The area of Washington that became home to GPO was at the edge of the developed part of the city. Most of the land between GPO and the capital was open farmland until the time of the Civil War.
Swamp Poodle was a very vibrant but fairly compact little neighborhood that grew up in this area just to the east of GPO, beginning around 1850 or so. And it was really a settlement for immigrants, mostly Irish immigrants, that had started coming to the country at the time. It was it got its name because it was a very swampy place. The Tiber Creek, one of the largest of the many creeks and streams that used to flow through the city, flowed right through the middle of Swamp Poodle. The neighborhood had a rather unsavory reputation. It was known for its gangs and its brawls.
Washington, which up to the outbreak of the war had been rather sleepy, small, and chronically underdeveloped, in wartime suddenly became a teeming, chaotic city.
Washington at the Civil War it began the Civil War as a small town, and it grew much faster than it really should have. There were a lot of people, a lot of soldiers mostly coming through. Washington was, of course, on the border between the North and the South, and as a result, it was a strategic transfer point for soldiers and the military, and so that affected the city a lot during the Civil War. You had many, many soldiers coming through all the time. Congress had always neglected the city up until that time. There were no paved roads. The sewer system was almost non-existent. The water system even was only in the process of being put in place. So it was it was a dirty place. It was known as a disease-ridden place. The streets around here were full of activity, it seems. There was particularly military activity, troops marching here and there, ambulances going back and forth, officers of various types, and then there were groups of runaway slaves moving about, and in addition to all the people who were trying to make their own living as they always did.
President Lincoln's choice to head the government printing office was John Defrees. Born in 1810 to an abolitionist family that moved from Tennessee to Ohio, he became a newspaperman and lawyer in Indiana. His fiery rhetoric and enthusiastic support helped Lincoln win the state in 1860. Defrees was described as a plainly dressed, quiet-mannered man who held strong convictions about issues important to him, especially temperance and abolition. A few days after Lincoln's inauguration, Defrees wrote to the president.
Dear Sir, imperative necessity alone prompts me to ask the appointment of Superintendent of Public Printing. I served a regular apprenticeship to the trade and regard myself as master of all its branches, having worked at it many years. I ask for the position because it is of my trade, and would think it hard that one not a printer should be preferred. I do hope that you may give me the position. Your tried friend, John Defrees.
16 days later, Lincoln appointed him. Both men lacked formal education, but had in common great erudition gained from reading and the study of rhetoric, the classics, and law. The Lincoln-Defrees working relationship developed rapidly. According to historian Douglas Wilson, Lincoln looked to Defrees as his own editor, and while Defrees seems to have respected and admired his chief's writing, his newspaperman's background gave him a critical eye. Lincoln's message to Congress of July 4, 1861, the first major communication of his presidency, was probably the first document he and Defrees conferred on. It was intended to set forth the president's views and the justifications for his actions in the first days of the rebellion.
In preparing the Library of Congress's exhibition, The Civil War in America, we wanted to make sure that we were telling both a story about individual people and the experience of the war on an individual level, but also some of the larger issues involved as well. Well, what Lincoln often did was he would write random thoughts on scraps of paper as they would occur to him, and later he would assemble those scraps of paper to try to draft in a manuscript form his message. And he was one who was very careful about language and how something was going to sound, whether someone heard it or read it. So he would work on these drafts multiple times. So we would often start out in manuscript draft, and then if it was more of an official message, like inaugural address or a message to Congress, then he would send it out to be typeset. So much as we might handwrite something, scribble notes to ourselves today, and then put them on the computer so that we can start working with them. Then once those typeset versions would come back, then Lincoln would start amending those, changing where commas would be, or adding language where he thought that language or something else needed to be. And then again, those would be resent back to GPO. Back in Springfield, he would have used his local newspaper to typeset and have that process. Once he got to Washington, with the advent of GPO, then he could work with John Defrees and the GPO in terms of getting those drafts that then could be refined and crafted into his final messages. Inspired by Doug Wilson, who had looked at this speech quite a bit, he mentioned the names in the corners, or the names on the pages of the manuscript draft. Plus, you also notice blue pencil marks on those manuscript drafts. So he suggested that those were probably the typesetters who had worked on that document. So having met a few people over at GPO, I contacted GPO to find out whether those names were indeed employees of the government printing office at that time. And so based on the list that I sent, we were able to confirm that at least most of them were GPO employees who were on the rolls. So we were able to see that even though this was a manuscript draft of the July 4th message, it had been sent to GPO, it had been assigned to different typesetters, and what Lincoln was receiving back was that typeset version that the typesetters had worked on. Well, John Defrees really provided almost editorial assistance in at least a couple of different ways that we can document. For one thing, Lincoln wrote not necessarily in terms of the proper rules of grammar. He wrote in the way that people would hear it, whether they read it in the newspaper and sounded it out in their head, or how someone would hear it if they were listening to something orally. So he put in commas where he wanted emphasis in a spoken version or an oral version, whereas John Defrees, coming from a journalistic background, was looking for the proper rules of grammar. So when the manuscript was sent to GPO, then Defrees was eliminating commas because they weren't supposed to be there in some cases. And you can see on the first version that we have that came back from GPO where Lincoln had reinserted commas, or in a few places he might have accepted a comma was gone one place but put in a new comma somewhere else. So again, as Doug Wilson calls it, it's the battle of the commas. There was also a charming story in some ways, but one that's very telling about Lincoln, that he used the word sugarcoat in his speech. He wanted to describe to Congress how it had been that the Southern people had gone along with secession and had been, in essence, dragged along into this new country. And he didn't want to blame the Southern people for that. He thought it was their leaders that were responsible. So he said something along the lines of, you know, these thoughts had been sugar-coated for the Southern people to the point that they had been taken along. And John Defrees complained that that was not a dignified enough word for a president to use. And Lincoln said something to the effect that there won't ever be a time when the American people don't understand what the word sugar-coated means. And Lincoln won and sugar-coated stayed.
The partnership between Lincoln and Defrees was a successful one. In December 1862, Defrees addressed John G. Nicolay, one of Lincoln's secretaries, with a message to the president that skillfully blends his role of editor with that of advisor.
Dear Sir, only a few events stand out prominently on the pages of the history of each century. The proposed proclamation of the President will be that one of this century, and it should be such a document as to justify the act in all coming time. If the President can only put his whole mind to its composition, It will be done. But I fear he will suffer himself to be so perplexed by outsiders that he will not give it proper thought. Can you not gently hint this much to him? Your friend, John D. Defrees.
Defrees is referring to the Emancipation Proclamation. The preliminary proclamation, printed by GPO, had been issued as a general order of the War Department on September 22, 1862, and Defrees was obviously anxious to receive Lincoln's revisions for the final version to be published at the beginning of 1863.
One thing to understand about the Emancipation Proclamation is that it was basically a war order, that it was something that Lincoln issued as commander-in-chief. So in that fashion, that explains the language, for one thing, that many people don't find it particularly inspiring in comparison with the Gettysburg Address. I think it's Richard Hofstadter compared it to a bill of lading. When it was sent to GPO, it was produced as a war order in a very small piece of paper. It's the same size and format as if you were getting a general order, a special order, a court-martial proceeding, that when you look at the printed document that would be distributed to the troops or whoever else needed to have a copy of it, it just looks like any other order. So from his very first reading of his preliminary proclamation in July of 1862, which was just read to the cabinet, to his official preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 62, to the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, the language changes, what's being discussed changes.
After the proclamation was published, Defrees advised Lincoln further.
Now, why not send a message to Congress recommending the passage of a joint resolution proposing an amendment to the Constitution forever prohibiting slavery in the states and territories?
Lincoln replied,
"Our own friends have this under consideration now, and will do as much without a resolution as with it."
Early in the Civil War, 2 companies of militia were formed from GPO employees, given time for drill and training, and set to guard the office at night. They were Company F, of printers, and Company G, bookbinders, of the so-called Interior Department Regiment, one of numerous local militias. In July 1864, Confederate forces under General Jubal Anderson Early defeated Union forces at Monocacy Junction, Maryland, and began a march toward Washington.
The Union did not know that Jubal Early had left Richmond with almost an entire corps of troops until July 5th, when they crossed over the Potomac. And remember, they had left on June 13th. And then the reports got it wrong. You know, they never got the number of troops right. They thought it was General Ewell, and they finally figured out it was Early. But there were some reports that Early had as many as 35,000 troops. And so Grant's getting this information, Lincoln's getting this information, Halleck is getting this information. Nobody wants to act on it. But Grant, seeing the same information, didn't. But one Union general did act on it, and that was Lew Wallace. At this point in the war, Wallace was the commanding general of the Middle Atlantic Department. Basically, it wasn't a good job. He was in Baltimore. He was sort of the military governor of Baltimore. Well, Wallace, acting on the same intelligence that Grant did not act on his own, gathered up 2,800 troops and headed down to a place 4 miles outside of Frederick, Maryland, called Monocacy, the Monocacy Junction. Wallace had about 6,000 troops under his command, and he faced Early at the Battle of Monocacy that lasted that entire day. Early prevailed. It was a very, very hot, very, very hot day. And Wallace was forced to retreat. There were 1,300 Union casualties killed, wounded, and taken prisoner, and about 800 Confederate casualties. So it wasn't a little skirmish. It was a pitched battle there for a good part of the day. Early let his troops rest one day on the battlefield, and the next day they headed to Washington, D.C. When the word came to Washington that Wallace had been defeated at Monocacy, there was panic in the streets because they were underdefended and they were facing an invasion from the Confederates. That's the next thing that happened, was that the call went out for basically all able-bodied men to come to the barricades. So you had this phenomenon of people, government workers, right, from all the different government departments, or as many as they could, being handed weapons and marching out to all these forts around the city.
GPO Company F, the printers, was mustered into service and marched to positions described as the vicinity of the insane asylum, that is, St. Elizabeth's Hospital in southeast Washington.
It was very chaotic, and it was scary for these people too, because they really thought they were going to be facing, not every one of them, but they really, it was in the air that the Confederates were, and Grant again dragged his feet. Remember, he dragged his feet sending the troops up to Monocacy, and only at the 11th hour did he finally send the rest of the 6th Corps from Richmond. At about noontime on July 11th, 1864, Early arrived outside of Fort Stevens, which is, you know, if you think of Washington as shaped like a diamond, it's near the top of the diamond, near Silver Spring, Maryland. And he, on his horse, looking through his glass, he could see the Capitol dome. Lee, in his orders, left it up to Early whether or not he would invade. And so Jubal Early had to make this decision of whether he was going to invade Washington, D.C. Now, what else did he see through his glass? Well, he saw the ramparts of Fort Stevens, and he saw men on the ramparts, on the parapets. He didn't know that they were clerks from the GPO, right, or the State Department, or militiamen who hadn't fired a weapon in a year, or 100 Days men, or invalids. He didn't know that. He saw there were a lot of men out there. However, he did have his artillery, brought the artillery up, and for the next, that day and the next day, July 11th and July 12th, there were artillery duels back and forth. There was skirmishing. The Union sent out some skirmishers, and in those 2 days of fighting, there were about 300 Union casualties killed and wounded in the fighting in Washington, D.C. I mean, not very many people know this. And we don't know the exact number of Confederate casualties, but it never made the official records. But we can pretty much assume it was at least that, if not more. Early had not decided to attack, but he did have this skirmishing going on July 11th. That night, he held a council of war. They decided that they would decide the next morning whether or not to invade on July 12th. So Early, who again was one of those commanders who was out there right in front of the troops, got up in the morning, went out to Fort Stevens. Now this time he saw that the 6th Corps was there. He saw the Greek emblem, and he decided not to invade. Still, the aggressive Early, there was still fighting that went on during the day of the 12th. When the Union troops woke up on the morning of July 13th, they looked out and Early was gone. In the middle of the night, he'd taken his troops. They went back out through Silver Spring. They went out through Montgomery County, Maryland, and then they crossed into Virginia on the morning of July 13th, 1864, at a place called White's Ferry, Virginia.
As the Confederate forces retreated, GPO's first veterans returned to their work in Swampoodle. Although actual documentation on Company F and Company G is scant, the first published history of GPO by R.W. Kerr, published in 1881, tells the story of GPO's own militiamen and gives a roster of those who served in both companies.
Everybody knows about Gettysburg and Bull Run and Manassas and the other large battles of the Civil War, and well, they should, Antietam and so on. I mean, Monocacy with its 2,100 total casualties was not Antietam with 21,000, but it was very important in the war, I think, in the end game, as was Fort Stevens. Consider what could have happened to Lincoln's presidential prospects if Jubal Early and thousands of lean and hungry Confederate troops had breached the defenses of Washington. I mean, there was the Treasury could have been burned, there was the White House could have been, who knows? And think of the headlines. I mean, we didn't have CNN back then, but the word got out. The war was very heavily covered in the newspapers and the news magazines. So this is another what if. It didn't happen, but had Early broken through, it could have changed a lot of things.
At the end of the war, GPO's growth and expansion continued. The Wendell Building was augmented and expanded until it finally covered nearly the entire half square. After President Lincoln's assassination in 1865, President Andrew Johnson replaced John Defrees with Cornelius Wendell, the printer who had built the first building. He served only 5 months until the Senate brought back Mr. Defrees. The neighborhood surrounding GPO developed too. One author wryly wrote that the glory that had been Swamp Poodle was flown, replaced by a more sedate residential section. Rows of new houses appeared to the north and east, and businesses from barbershops to grocers to haberdashers flourished. The rapidly growing GPO was at the center of it. The lunch counters and saloons that catered to its needs, and the sheer number of people coming and going on the 3 daily shifts kept for the neighborhood some of the edginess of old Swampoodle. As the 20th century dawned, Swampoodle's chaotic streets and alleyways were all swept away by the construction of the Union Station terminal and rail yards, opened in 1907.
Swampoodle really had its heyday, if you want to call it that, as a neighborhood community from the 1850s through the end of the century. At the end, around the turn of the century, the plans were developed to build Union Station. And Union Station, which was a truly massive project, really put an end to Swampoodle. In fact, the footprint of the original Swampoodle, which was really from about between G&H and North Capitol and to several blocks east of North Capitol, that entire footprint is covered over by Union Station and the tracks behind it and so forth. So that was the end.
Emblematic of GPO's growth and expansion was a Civil War-related printing job, the largest single order in GPO history. The official records of the War of the Rebellion were 127 volumes of first-hand reports on every campaign and engagement from Union and Confederate officers. Every page was set by hand by GPO printers.
We're very, very lucky to have this amazing 127 volume official record that was what was put together in the 1880s, I guess, of both sides in the Civil War. It's not totally inclusive, but it has lots of material. So, and luckily for a researcher these days, it's available online as well as, in libraries.
Compiling and printing the official records took 20 years. When it was completed in 1900, GPO was on the verge of its next great era of expansion, when technological advances and increased demand saw it become the largest print shop in the world.